The sprawling halls of Lincoln International Airport buzzed with a medley of sounds, rolling suitcases, distant chatter, and the rhythmic echo of announcements. Among the sea of travelers moved Captain Adrian Ace Monroe, his tall frame clad in a casual ensemble of dark jeans and a crisp polo shirt. A seasoned African-American pilot, Ace carried an air of quiet confidence earned through decades of service. Today, he was en route to a global aviation summit to present revolutionary safety protocols he had co-developed. Ace's pace quickened as he approached the airline crew lounge entrance. Before he could pass through, Officer Derek Marshall, a burly man with a reputation for overzealousness, blocked his path. His sharp eyes scanned Ace with an unspoken judgment. "Excuse me, sir," Derek said, voice laced with skepticism. "This area is for authorized personnel only." Ace maintained his composure, offering a professional smile as he handed over his ID. "I'm Captain Monroe, heading to the crew lounge before my flight." Derek barely glanced at the badge before narrowing his gaze. "Captain, huh? This doesn't look real. Where'd you get it? Some online shop?" A small crowd began to gather, murmurs of curiosity rippling through the terminal. Ace's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "Officer, I've been flying for years. If you have doubts, you can verify my credentials with airport administration." Derek smirked, crossing his arms. "Flying what? Kites. You don't look like a captain to me." The tense exchange drew Laura Bennett, an aviation journalist fresh off her flight. Recognizing Ace, she pushed through the crowd. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Derek shot her an annoyed glance. "This guy claims he's a pilot. Doesn't check out." Laura's eyes flashed. "Doesn't check out? That's Captain Adrian Monroe, one of the most respected figures in aviation today. Do you even know who you're talking to?" Derek faltered, his bravado cracking under Laura's sharp tone. Meanwhile, Airport Director Margaret Hayes arrived, alerted by the commotion. "Captain Monroe, I apologize for this misunderstanding," she said, her gaze hardening as it fell on Derek. "This will be addressed." The crowd dispersed, but not before bystanders uploaded videos of the incident to social media, sparking a wave of outrage. Ace, though shaken, focused on the task ahead. The summit awaited, and his mission to advance aviation safety and inclusivity was far from over. By the time Captain Adrian Ace Monroe reached the summit venue, the internet had already turned the airport incident into a global talking point. Clips of Officer Derek Marshall's confrontation with Ace, paired with Laura Bennett's fiery defense, spread across social media like wildfire. Hashtags like #RespectAce and #EndProfilingNow trended within hours. Ace entered the Grand Conference Hall, a modern space filled with aviation professionals from around the world. The air buzzed with anticipation for the day's presentations. As he made his way to the podium, whispers followed him, but not the kind that made him feel small. These were murmurs of recognition and admiration. Laura Bennett, seated near the front with her notebook in hand, gave him an encouraging nod. She had been fielding calls for major news outlets all morning, her article on the incident already half written in her mind. Though the world seemed focused on the injustice Ace faced, she was determined to highlight his work, something far more impactful. Ace glanced at his phone before beginning his presentation. Messages of support poured in from colleagues, friends, and strangers. Some offered apologies on behalf of a system they felt powerless to change. Others shared stories of their own battles against prejudice. It was overwhelming, but it steeled his resolve. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the audience. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice resonating through the hall. "Before we dive into the cutting-edge protocols we've developed, I want to address something that happened earlier today." The room fell silent. Ace's steady gaze scanned the audience. "This morning, I was reminded that no matter how much you achieve, no matter how many barriers you break, there will always be those who question your place, based on nothing more than their assumptions about how you look." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. "But," Ace continued, his tone unwavering, "I am not here to dwell on the past. I am here to look to the future. A future where innovation in aviation safety is paired with a commitment to inclusivity. Our skies are shared by everyone, and our industry must reflect that." Applause broke out, building into a standing ovation. As Ace launched into his presentation, the crowd hung on his every word. He spoke with clarity and passion about the new protocols designed to make air travel safer for millions. Yet, beneath the technical details, his message carried a deeper resonance, a call to rise above biases and create a more equitable industry. By the time he finished, the applause was deafening. Reporters like Laura hurried to capture the moment, knowing it was history in the making. Meanwhile, Derek Marshall sat in a small airport break room, watching the event unfold on TV. His face burned with shame as he listened to Ace's words. For the first time, he began to question his own actions and the biases that had driven them. Unbeknownst to Ace, his morning's ordeal had ignited a broader conversation. What began as a moment of prejudice had evolved into a rallying cry for progress, one that he was uniquely positioned to lead. As the applause faded and the summit transitioned to its next speaker, Ace retreated to a quiet lounge backstage. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts. The morning's confrontation still lingered at the edges of his mind, but the overwhelming support he'd received from the audience and online was undeniable. Yet, beneath it all, a question gnawed at him. Would things truly change? Laura Bennett found him sitting in a quiet corner, nursing a cup of tea. She approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "Captain Monroe," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" Ace looked up, his tired eyes softening at the sight of her. "Laura, of course, and please call me Ace." She smiled and took the seat across from him. "Ace, I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything today. You could have let anger define the moment, but instead you turned it into something powerful." Ace sighed, setting his cup down. "It's not the first time I've faced something like this, Laura. I've learned that anger burns out quickly, but purpose lasts." Laura nodded, taking out her notebook. "I'm writing about what happened this morning, but I don't want the focus to just be on the incident. I want people to understand who you are and what you've done for aviation." Ace hesitated. "The work speaks for itself. I don't want to overshadow the team that made it possible." "And that humility," Laura said, her tone gentle, "is exactly why your story needs to be told." Meanwhile, across the airport, Derek Marshall sat in his car during his break, unable to shake the events of the morning. He'd watched the entire summit speech, each word from Ace a mirror reflecting his own prejudices. For the first time, Derek wasn't justifying his actions but questioning them. What had led him to judge Ace so quickly? Was it fear? Ignorance? He opened his phone to the trending hashtag #RespectAce and scrolled through hundreds of posts. Many shared stories of people of color being underestimated or profiled in their own professions. Derek read them all, each post chipping away at the wall of defensiveness he'd built over the years. One comment stuck with him. "Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers so quietly you don't realize it's guiding your every move. Recognizing it is the first step to unlearning it." Derek set the phone down, staring out at the horizon. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, guilt mingled with hope. Back at the summit, Laura finished her conversation with Ace, promising to give him a preview of her article. As she left, Ace leaned back, letting the exhaustion of the day sink in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but today had planted seeds. Whether they grew into something meaningful depended on everyone involved. Unbeknownst to him, those seeds had already begun to sprout in the most unexpected of places. The following morning, the summit buzzed with renewed energy. The incident involving Captain Adrian Ace Monroe had become the unspoken undercurrent of every conversation, But Ace, ever the professional, carried on as though it hadn't happened. He attended panels, spoke with young aviators, and shared his expertise. Yet, his thoughts lingered on something Laura had said the day before. Your story needs to be told. In another corner of the city, Officer Derek Marshall stood outside the airport director's office, summoned for a meeting he had been dreading. Clutching a folder of incident reports, he tried to steady his nerves. His reflection in the glass door stared back at him, judgmental and unyielding. He wasn't sure who he despised more at that moment, the man in the reflection or the man who had created this mess. Inside, Margaret Hayes, the airport director, waited with a neutral expression. When Derek entered, she gestured for him to sit. Officer Marshall, do you know why you're here? Derek nodded but couldn't meet her gaze. The incident with Captain Monroe. Margaret leaned forward, her tone calm but firm. It wasn't just an incident. It was a failure. Yours and ours. You didn't just misjudge a man. You misjudged a leader, a pioneer. Do you understand the damage this has caused? Derek swallowed hard, nodding. I do. I've been thinking about it a lot. Margaret's piercing eyes softened slightly. Good. Because thinking isn't enough. Change requires action. Effective immediately, you're suspended from active duty and enrolled in mandatory cultural sensitivity training. I expect a full report on what you've learned before you return. Derek's face burned with shame, but he nodded again. Understood. As Derek left the office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend, a retired cop he respected deeply. Saw the footage. Tough to watch, but tougher to ignore. Use this as a chance to grow. We all have blind spots. The question is, will you fix yours? Later that day, Ace found himself at a networking luncheon with young aviators from diverse backgrounds. They crowded around him, asking questions about his career, his challenges, and his triumphs. Among them was Maya Coleman, a young black woman training to be a pilot. Her eyes sparkled with admiration. Captain Monroe, Maya began, her voice trembling slightly. How do you stay strong when people doubt you because of how you look? Ace paused, his gaze meeting hers. Maya, you'll face moments that test you, just like I have. But you don't fight back with anger, you fight back with excellence. Every time someone doubts you, you show them what you're made of. You prove them wrong, not to spite them, but to remind yourself that you belong. Maya nodded, her expression determined. Thank you, Captain. That means a lot. As the luncheon continued, Ace felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him. It was about paving the way for the next generation. His story wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Meanwhile, Derek sat at home, scrolling through resources on implicit bias. A recommended video caught his eye. A TED Talk by a black executive on confronting prejudice. As he watched, the speaker's words resonated deeply. Acknowledging bias doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave. It's the first step toward understanding, and understanding is what leads to change. For the first time in years, Derek felt something shift. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't remain the man he had been. The days after the summit were a whirlwind for Captain Adrian Ace Monroe. His speech had not only ignited important conversations within the aviation community, but had also reached audiences far beyond it. Messages poured in from aspiring pilots, industry leaders, and ordinary people inspired by his resilience. Ace had become a symbol of strength and progress, though he wished it hadn't come through such an incident. Back at the airport, Officer Derek Marshall began his first session of cultural sensitivity training. The room was small but welcoming, filled with individuals from various professions who had also been sent there due to incidents rooted in unconscious bias. Their facilitator, Dr. Alina Price, was a charismatic woman with a no-nonsense attitude and a gift for making difficult conversations feel accessible. Welcome, Dr. Price began, her voice steady. You're here because something in your behavior hurt someone else. Maybe you didn't mean it, maybe you did, but intent doesn't erase impact. This space isn't about punishment, it's about understanding. So let's start with a simple question. What makes you uncomfortable? Derek fidgeted, unsure of how to respond. When it was his turn, he hesitated before speaking. I guess I don't always know how to approach people who are different from me. It's like I'm scared of saying or doing the wrong thing, so I overcompensate. Dr. Price nodded thoughtfully. Fear of making mistakes often leads to defensiveness. But the real mistake is not trying at all. Bias thrives in silence. The more we talk, the more we learn. Over the next few sessions, Derek listened to stories from people who had faced discrimination. Each story chipped away at his preconceived notions. He also had to confront his own biases, ones he had never even realized he carried. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Meanwhile, Ace received an unexpected message from the airport administration. Margaret Hayes had invited him to return to Lincoln International for a private meeting with Derek Marshall, who had specifically requested the opportunity to apologize in person. At first, Ace wasn't sure if he wanted to go. What could Derek possibly say that would change what had happened? But after some thought, he decided to accept. 2 weeks later, they met in a quiet conference room at the airport. Derek stood as Ace entered, his face a mixture of nervousness and remorse. Captain Monroe, Derek began, his voice unsteady, thank you for agreeing to meet me. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for the assumptions I made about you and about so many others before you. I was wrong, and I'm working to make sure I never treat anyone that way again. Ace studied Derek for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Acknowledging it is a start. What matters is what you do from here. Derek's shoulders relaxed slightly. I've been attending training, and I've learned so much already. I know it's just the beginning, but I want to do better. Ace leaned forward, his tone firm but not unkind. Derek, the work you're doing now isn't for me. It's for you and the people you'll encounter in the future. You can't undo the past, but you can make sure it doesn't repeat itself. Derek nodded, humbled by Ace's grace. Thank you. I won't forget this. As Ace left the airport that day, he felt a surprising sense of closure. Derek's apology didn't erase the pain of the incident, but it was a step, a small but meaningful step toward change. Back in his car, Ace glanced at his phone, where another message from Maya Coleman awaited. She had just completed her first solo flight and wanted to thank him for his encouragement. Smiling, Ace replied, "The skies belong to you now, Maya. Fly high." A week later, Captain Adrian Ace Monroe stood in front of a full auditorium at Lincoln International Airport. The event was a special symposium organized in his honor, titled Breaking Barriers, Diversity, and Leadership in Aviation. It was the culmination of a week-long campaign sparked by his ordeal and subsequent speech at the summit. The audience included aspiring pilots, seasoned industry professionals, and aviation enthusiasts. Among them was Maya Coleman, who sat in the front row, her notebook balanced on her knee. Next to her was Laura Bennett, scribbling furiously for an article she promised would amplify the event's impact. Ace took the stage, a quiet power emanating from him. The room fell silent as he began. When I first became a pilot, I didn't think much about what I represented, he started. I thought about flying, the joy of taking to the skies. But as the years went on, I realized something. Being up there isn't just about skill or determination. It's about opening doors for those who come after you. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. What happened to me here at this very airport was not unique. It's a reality many face daily. But the question isn't why it happens. It's how we respond to it. Do we let it ground us, or do we rise above the clouds? The audience erupted into applause, their admiration palpable. Ace continued, his voice steady. To the young aviators here, like Maya in the front row, I say this. Your place in this industry is not a privilege, it's a right. You belong here because you've earned it. Don't let anyone make you question that. Maya's eyes glistened as she gave Ace a small, encouraging nod. In a quiet corner of the room, Officer Derek Marshall sat unassumingly. He had insisted on attending the symposium, though he hadn't expected to be noticed. Listening to Ace's words, Derek felt a mix of pride and humility. He was far from the man he wanted to be, but he was trying, step by step. After the event, Derek approached Ace hesitantly. "Captain Monroe," he began, his voice unsure, "I just wanted to say, your words today, they hit home. Thank you." Ace regarded him thoughtfully before extending a hand. "Keep learning, Derek. That's how change happens." They shook hands, a gesture that, while small, symbolized something larger, the possibility of growth, redemption, and understanding. Later that evening, as Ace prepared to leave, Maya caught up with him. "Captain Monroe," she said breathlessly, "I just wanted to thank you again. Your story, your advice, it's changed how I see my future." Ace smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your future is bright, Maya. Keep pushing forward, and remember, every challenge is just turbulence. It passes." As Maya left, Ace looked out at the horizon, where the sun was setting in hues of gold and crimson. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The skies, with all their vastness and promise, were where he belonged. And his journey, like the journeys of so many others, was only beginning. The weeks that followed the symposium were transformative. Captain Adrian Ace Monroe's story had sparked a global movement within aviation and beyond. Airports and airlines began reevaluating their training programs, incorporating mandatory bias awareness sessions, and promoting diverse leadership within their ranks. The ripple effects of one morning's confrontation now stretched across the skies. For Ace, life returned to a familiar rhythm, though something inside him had shifted. His experience at Lincoln International wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a much larger journey, one he now fully embraced. His voice had become a rallying cry, and he realized that with it came a responsibility to inspire change. One evening, Ace found himself sitting on the balcony of his home, the distant hum of city life below. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Laura Bennett. "The article is live. Thought you'd like to see how it ends." Curious, Ace clicked the link. Laura's article was titled, "Soaring Beyond Bias, the Story of Captain Adrian Monroe." He read through her thoughtful narrative, which not only detailed the airport incident, but also celebrated his contributions to aviation and his unwavering resolve to create a more inclusive industry. The final lines stayed with him. Captain Adrian Monroe didn't just rise above adversity, he turned it into a flight path for others to follow. His legacy isn't just in the skies, but in the hearts of those he's inspired to believe they belong. Ace leaned back, staring at the darkening sky. The words resonated deeply, but he knew his work was far from over. At Lincoln International, Officer Derek Marshall returned to duty after completing his sensitivity training. He had spent weeks reflecting on his actions and listening to stories from individuals who had experienced discrimination. Derek wasn't the same man who had stood in Ace's path that day. He carried himself with a new sense of awareness, striving to treat every traveler with respect and fairness. One afternoon, Derek spotted a group of schoolchildren touring the airport. Among them was a young black boy wearing a toy pilot's hat, his eyes wide with wonder. Derek smiled and approached the boy. "Hey there, future captain," he said warmly. "Ready to take to the skies?" The boy beamed, clutching his hat proudly. "One day I will." Derek chuckled. "I don't doubt it." At another corner of the world, Maya Coleman completed her flight training. On the day of her final certification, she sent Ace a picture of herself in her pilot's uniform, her face glowing with pride. "I did it, Captain Monroe. Thanks for showing me the way." Ace replied, "Congratulations, Captain Coleman. The skies are yours. Fly high." The story of Captain Adrian Monroe continued to inspire. His name became synonymous with progress and perseverance, his story a beacon for those breaking barriers in their own lives. The skies that once felt so vast and unwelcoming now seemed a little more open, a little more inviting. As Ace prepared for his next flight, he gazed at the runway stretching ahead, a perfect metaphor for the journey still to come. The world was changing, slowly perhaps, but it was changing, and he was proud to be part of that movement. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the tarmac, ready to take to the skies once more. The legacy of Captain Adrian Ace Monroe had only just begun. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.